The NIEM implementation of roles lacks the concept of a generic role type from which you would derive more specific roles. Instead, each role is created independently from complex object type. You can identify roles by the presence of a role of something reference inside of them. Roles that can be played by people have a role of person reference inside of them. Those played by organizations have a role of organization reference. Those which can be played by either a person or an organization will have both role of person reference and role of organization reference inside of them. And then roles that are played by an item will have a role of item reference inside of them. Again, remember, this is not specialization. Someone playing a role isn't a special kind of person. An item playing a role isn't a special kind of item. An organization playing a role is not a special kind of organization. Roles are like hats. Roles aren't people. Roles are hats that people wear. And it's the same true for roles of organizations and roles of items as well. They're not actually special items, organizations, and they're not special people. They're roles that these people, organizations, and items play. As an example, let's take a look at the juvenile role out of the CIFAS domain. So we've got a complex type called juvenile type, and this is the type for the juvenile role. Now, how do we know that? Well, we don't know it from the extension because the extension is just based on complex object type. At this point, all we have is an empty container to hold other things, an empty container called juvenile type. And then we see the first thing added to it is a juvenile arrest friends indicator, and that doesn't really tell us much. And then we see a whole bunch of stuff that's deleted because it won't fit on the screen. And then we see the role of person reference. Aha! At this point, we know that this is a role. It's a role of person reference inside of it, which will point to a person playing the role of a juvenile. So here's where we know that, oh, we're talking about a role. Then we see some other things that are specific to the role of a juvenile. So juvenile special needs indicator, juvenile special need, juvenile strengths, interests, description text, juvenile troubled friends indicator, and there's a whole slew more. There are tons of things inside the juvenile role. But the way we know it's a role is because it has a role of person reference. We don't look at the base type for roles. For some of the other relationships we do, but for roles we don't. The base type for a role is complex object type. What we do look for is that role of whatever reference inside of it. And then at the bottom we see the element declaration of a juvenile, an element called juvenile of our juvenile type. And so that's the actual element playing the role. And that juvenile object then would have a role of person reference inside of it, and that reference would have a ref equals that points to the ID that a person object would have that represents the person who is playing the role of juvenile. Again, I know it sounds a little complicated, but it's very, very powerful and very, very flexible and very good at reflecting real-world relationships, which is one of the things the NIEM is all about. We want to be able to accurately represent things in the real world. Similarly, let's look at the student role. Again, this is a chunk of schema from the CIFAS domain showing the student role. It's a complex type. The name of the type is student type. Again, when we see the base is just complex object type. It doesn't tell us there that we're dealing with a role. But here we see, and in this case it's the very first thing listed, the role of person reference. Haha, at this point again, now we know that student type represents a role. Now after that are all sorts of things about the role of a student. So student current education grade level, actually an education object, some adjustment stuff, special education things, student identification, student photo image, and a whole bunch more that were deleted again so that we could get this on the screen. So here is a student role. At the bottom we see the element called student of our new student type, and that's the element that actually portrays the role that a student plays. So you'd have a student element, and inside of there you'd have a role of person reference that would point to a person element, which would be the person playing the student role. Let's take a look at that. So here's what the snippet of an instance document would look like, showing a person playing the roles of a juvenile and a student. We see at the top that there's a person object, and it has an ID, ID 0001. Again, the ID is just a unique string to identify this object in the instance document. This isn't this person's real-world ID. It's an internal ID just for this XML document, so don't get that confused. Internal ID. And this person has a person name, and inside the person name is person full name and some full name information there. Following that is the juvenile role from the CIFAS domain. So we've got a CIFAS juvenile, and inside of that is the role of person reference. Ref equals ID 0001, the same ID as the ID for the person. So this reference points to the person that's right above it. After that is another role, the student role. Again, this has a role of person reference ref equals ID 0001 matches the ID for the person object. So in the end, what we have here is a person object and two roles that person is playing. Each of those roles points to the person. That's how we know which person is playing the roles. Keep in mind that each of these roles could also contain additional role-specific information as defined in the schema on the previous two slides. The idea here is that we can very accurately reflect real-world roles in all their complexity. If we can't show the real world, then how are we going to exchange meaningful data? So the NIEM tries very hard to be able to do so. And roles are one of the mechanisms by which it does that. Now let's try an exercise using roles. As we've been talking about, roles are an integral part of the NIEM and of CIFAS itself. CIFAS has tons of roles in it. Using the snippet of schema that we're going to give you on the next slide and the example person object from the previous slide, so you can it's just a person object with a name in it, it's not much to it. Create an instance document linking that person object and the CIFAS child victim role object, and we'll see the definition for child victim role on the next slide. You can add as many of the child victim role object properties listed as you want. They're all just text strings, so you don't have to go try searching out what those are all made of. They're text strings. They're all of text type. Now, one thing I want to mention at this point is that the exercises build on each other. So we're going to be doing some on associations and some on metadata as well. So save your work from this exercise because we'll be adding to it in a few more exercises as we work our way through some of the other concepts. So here's the snippet of schema you're going to use, and it's taken directly out of the NIEM, in particular out of the CIFAS domain. And we see at the top that we're defining a complex type called child victim type. And if we look down in the sequence of things that it'll contain, you'll see role of person reference saying, aha, child victim is a role that a person plays. Pretty tragic role, but a role nonetheless. And then a few more things: custody status text, placement change, reason text, placement text. And then at the bottom we have the element child victim. And so the idea is create a child victim object and link it to a person object. And here is the solution. We have the person object taken directly from a slide a few slides back with an ID of ID 0001. Again, that's just a unique internal ID for this XML document. It's not a real world ID. And they've got a name, some name. And then we add our role. So we have our CIFAS child victim role. Inside of there is a role of person reference. That's how we know it's a role. And it references the same ID as the ID that the person object has, thereby linking this to that person object, saying this is a role that that person is playing. And then we added custody status text just to put a little bit more into that object, and there we go. Now remember, keep this. Hopefully you type this up in something. Keep it because we're going to add to it in the later exercises.